Bonjour tout le monde. Morning, everyone. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to note the appointment of Tiff Macklem as the next Governor of the Bank of Canada. Mr. Macklem, who is currently the Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, has extensive experience in the global financial system and risk management. With his appointment, the Bank of Canada will be well positioned to help with the economic response and eventual recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to note that May 1st marks the beginning of Asian and Jewish Heritage Month. Unfortunately, we've seen a rise in anti-Asian sentiment lately, and this week, 2 more anti-Semitic incidents took place. It's important to celebrate who we are at all times and not give in to hatred or fear. When times are tough, Canadians come together. That is who we are. Le 6 décembre.
On December 6, 1989, I was in Montreal, in Cégep, at the bottom of the hill to Polytechnic. I couldn't tell you what I was studying that day, but I will never forget the moment when I heard the first reports of a shooting at Polytechnic. At first, I was shocked. I was 17 years old, and I couldn't understand that such an act of violence towards women could happen in a country such as ours, in a society such as ours.
As their version of this story. Every one of us remembers the day when we realized that even in Canada, a man with a gun could irrevocably alter our lives for the worse. We remember how our sense of safety was shaken, how our worldview was changed. École Polytechnique, Mayerthorpe, Dawson College, Moncton, La Loche, La Grande Mosquée de Québec, the Danforth, Fredericton, and Cumberland, Colchester, and Hants counties, Nova Scotia. These tragedies reverberate still. They shape our identity. They stain our conscience. They make adults out of children. And the heartbreaking truth is they're happening more often than they once did. With each passing year, more families are ripped apart by tragedy. More parents are struggling to explain the inexplicable to their kids. And more teenagers are growing up in a world where gun violence is normalized. It needs to stop. Last week, 22 Canadians were killed in the deadliest rampage in our country's history. They were nurses and teachers, correctional officers and RCMP officers. They were someone's child, someone's best friend, someone's partner. Their families deserve more than thoughts and prayers. Canadians deserve more than thoughts and prayers. Lors des dernières élections, nous nous sommes engagés.
During the last elections, we committed to banning assault-style weapons, and we put in place a program to buy back these weapons. We announced our intention to work with the provincial and territorial governments in order to allow municipalities to ban handguns. We also promised to take other measures in order to save lives. In October, Canadians confided in their elected officials a clear mandate to restrict the use of these weapons in Canada, and we intend to maintain our engagement.
For military-grade assault weapons in Canada. We are banning 1,500 models and variants of these firearms by way of regulations. These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada. For many families, including many Indigenous people, firearms are part of traditions passed down through generations, and the vast majority of gun owners use them safely, responsibly, and in accordance with the law, whether it be for work, sport shooting, for collecting, or for hunting. But you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer. So, effective immediately, it is no longer permitted to buy, sell, transport, import, or use military-grade assault weapons in this country. To protect law-abiding gun owners from criminal liability until they can take steps to comply with this new law, there will be a 2-year amnesty period, and we will legislate fair compensation. Now, I want to take a moment to recognize the leadership of Minister Blair on this file. Tackling gun violence has been a personal and professional priority of his for decades. He's done incredible work to make this policy a reality, and we are here today thanks to his leadership and to the leadership of people like him. Merci, Bill. Aujourd'hui, nous fermons.
Today, we are closing the market on military-grade assault weapons in Canada. We are banning 1,500 models and variants of this type of firearm. These weapons were used for one goal: killing the largest amount of people as quickly as possible. They have no use and have no place here in Canada. Throughout the country, many people use firearms legally and responsibly for work or for hunting, but you don't need an AR-15 in order to shoot a deer. So, from this moment on, it is no longer permitted to sell, to buy, to transport, to import, or to use military-grade assault weapons in Canada. In order to protect responsible owners from criminal liability, there will be a 2-year amnesty period so that they can comply to these new regulations. We have the intention of tabling a bill in order to ensure fair compensation shortly.
An entire generation of Canadians will remember exactly where they were on Sunday, April 18th, 2020. They will remember how their sense of safety was shaken, how their outlook on the world was forever changed. They will remember the day that they lost some of their innocence. This chapter in our history cannot be rewritten, but what happens next is up to us. We can stick to thoughts and prayers alone, or we can unite as a country and put an end to this. We can decide together that enough is enough. Today's announcement builds on the things we did during our first term. It's the next step. And there is more work ahead to implement this and pass legislation to further strengthen our laws. I've already spoken with the other parliamentary leaders, and I know that we will be able to work together and do even more to keep Canadians safe. Every single Canadian wants to see less gun violence and safer communities. So today, we take another big step forward. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and good morning, everyone. Before I begin my remarks, I'd like to take the opportunity to extend my sincere condolences to the families of those that were lost in the helicopter crash off the coast of Greece on Wednesday. We will always remember their service and their sacrifice. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today for what I believe to be a very significant and yet solemn occasion. A few weeks ago, in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, Canada suffered its worst mass shooting in the country's history. 22 innocent lives were lost over the course of a weekend rampage across beautiful communities throughout Nova Scotia. Canadians were shocked and they were heartbroken. And as we learned the identities of the victims of these terrible crimes, we were reminded of the tragic impact that gun violence can have on all of our communities, urban and rural, from coast to coast to coast. Mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, friends and neighbors were taken from us terribly, violently, and far too soon. And sadly, gun violence is not a new thing in our society, but it's made all the more deadly with the proliferation of firearms that are more powerful than ever before. Assault-style firearms, those that were not designed for hunting or sport shooting, but they have become more and more prevalent in our Canadian retail market. And for as long as these guns have existed, they have been capable of inflicting tremendous damage when they fall into the wrong hands. And for example, in 1989, 14 women were murdered at École Polytechnique in a horrific act of deadly misogyny. 17 years later, Montreal was shaken yet again with the shooting at Dawson College. In 2014, Moncton was terrorized by a criminal that took the lives of 3 RCMP officers. And 3 years ago, in January, in Saint-Ouen, Quebec, a shooter killed 6 innocent Muslims while they were in prayer. Many of us have vivid and tragic memories of each of these events. They have become, sadly, a part of our history, these tragic moments when innocent women, worshippers, police officers, and innocent Canadians across the country have been killed by evil people wielding powerful guns. For decades, chiefs of police, advocacy groups, grieving families, and everyday Canadians have been calling for a ban of these types of firearms, guns that were designed for soldiers to kill other soldiers and not for recreational purposes, guns that belong on a battlefield and not on our streets, guns that were designed to kill people. They were intended in their purpose to kill people, and they have been used in Canada to kill innocent people. And for decades, Canadians have been calling upon successive governments for reform, for stronger gun control. And we have listened. And today we are taking action. Today, as the Prime Minister has said, we are announcing an immediate ban on over 1,500 models of assault-style firearms. And effective immediately, these newly banned firearms cannot be legally used, sold, or imported in our country. And as of today, the market for assault weapons in Canada is closed. Enough is enough. And we are ending the proliferation of these weapons and the militarization of our society. From this moment forward, the number of these guns will only decrease in Canada. We've heard many people express concern about the militarization of our police, and this is a direct consequence of the militarization of society. And Canadians deserve to live in a society where they can be safe and secure. And people from coast to coast have been clear. We cannot risk another shooting at a school or a place of worship or another attack on police officers or on women or on innocent Canadians anywhere in this country. Banning assault-style firearms will save Canadian lives. I'd like to take a moment, if I may, to speak to the law-abiding Canadian gun owners. I know from very many years of experience as a police officer that the overwhelming majority of gun owners in this country are law-abiding. They are responsible. They are conscientious. They acquire their weapons legally, they store them securely, and they use them safely. They respect our laws, and we respect them. I want to assure hunters and farmers and target shooters in this country that nothing that we are doing today or will do in the future is intended to interfere with this lawful, responsible, and legal activity. However, we are today ending the availability of weapons that were not designed for hunting or for target shooting. They were rather designed for soldiers to kill other soldiers. And while I appreciate that some may feel that these weapons have some recreational value, the tragic reality is that these weapons were designed to kill people and have been used to kill innocent Canadians. Public safety must always be our first priority. And these powerful firearms become deadly weapons when they fall into the wrong hands. Protecting human life must come above all else. These guns have no legitimate civilian purpose. They don't belong in our communities. And I will also say that the banning of these assault weapons is an important step. But let me also acknowledge that we know that there is much more to do. We will introduce legislation at the first opportunity to fulfill our commitments to Canadians, to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, by strengthening our storage laws, by preventing gun trafficking and smuggling. We will bring in greater control of ammunition and magazine capacities. And perhaps most importantly, we will bring in red flag laws that allow law enforcement to remove firearms from dangerous situations to make sure that they don't become deadly. We will empower victims, communities, doctors, families. We will empower Canadians to render their situation safe. And where there is firearms in a situation that could be dangerous, we know that situation can become deadly. And red flag laws will empower us to keep Canadians safe. We will do all of these things, and we will keep working hard to make our streets safer for our kids and grandkids. I would remind us all that over the last 4 years, we have taken real measures to strengthen gun control. We've invested over $327 million to fight gun and gang violence. That meant, for example, more resources for local law enforcement to investigate gang-related activity. It meant funding for projects which were focused on things like keeping kids in school, giving support to victims of human trafficking, and preventing gang recruitment. We brought in Bill C-71, which, among other measures, strengthens background checks to help ensure guns don't end up in the wrong hands. And last year, in the fall, we campaigned on a promise to do more. Today, we are moving forward on our promise and our plan to deliver safer streets and stronger communities for generations to come. Canada can know a future with less gun violence and less tragedy. By taking action today, we can give our kids and our grandkids a better chance at a brighter, safer tomorrow. Thank you all very much.
Merci. Bon matin. Je suis fier d'être.
Good morning. I'm proud to be here with my colleagues and the Prime Minister to talk about important measures that we are putting in place. We know that the number of crimes committed with firearms has increased over the past years. In 2017, there were 2,500 additional victims than in 2013.
Were designed for use on the battlefield, have made their way into our community, and have been used to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Minister Blair mentioned tragic incidents that live in the mind of all Canadians. Mothers and fathers, children, friends and neighbors, whose lives were taken in senseless acts of violence. En tant que Montréalais, mais surtout en tant que père.
As a Montrealer, but also as a father of 2 daughters and family member of a former Polytechnic student, I can tell you that the shooting of 14 young women in Polytechnic is very fresh in our collective memory, even 30 years later.
Anastasia de Souza, whose promising life was tragically cut short at Dawson College. La tristesse et la terreur que nous avons tous ressentis.
We felt sadness and terror, and this allowed us to have a more strict regulation of firearms. The Firearms Act put in place new regulations in 1995.
In 2019, Canadians gave us a clear mandate to act. As Minister Blair explained, today we are moving forward with this commitment by announcing an immediate prohibition of over 1,500 makes and models of military-style firearms. Ce sont des armes à feu de calibre.
These are military caliber, military-grade firearms that were created in order to have the most victims as quickly as possible.
Weapons are effective immediately. We are, however, taking reasonable steps to provide Canadians with the time and guidance to properly and safely deactivate or remove these items from their possession. To do this, we are putting in place an amnesty order under the Criminal Code, beginning today and effective until April 30th, 2022. This amnesty period will give a lawful owner in possession of these newly prohibited firearms a reasonable time frame to come into compliance without facing criminal liability for unlawful possession. By the end of this amnesty period, all Canadians must be in compliance with the law. Il y a des règles claires sur ce qui est permis.
There are clear laws on what is allowed and what is not allowed during this amnesty period.
Anyone in possession of these newly prohibited firearms can no longer use them, even during the amnesty period. Secondly, these firearms cannot be imported or sold to individuals in Canada. Third, these firearms can be legally exported during the 2-year time frame with a valid export permit. In addition, a business owner may return the firearm to its manufacturer. Finally, these firearms must be safely stored in accordance with the law. They can only be transferred or transported for the purposes of deactivation, export with a permit, or surrender to police without compensation, or if the person is not the owner of the firearm, to return the firearm to its rightful owner. There will be an exception for Indigenous peoples exercising a Section 35 hunting right, as well as those who use the weapon for hunting to feed themselves or their family. They may continue using firearms that were previously non-restricted for these purposes until a suitable replacement can be acquired. We are asking that no one attempt to surrender their firearm while social distancing because of COVID-19 is being practiced. As I have indicated, at the end of the amnesty period, all firearm owners will have to be in compliance with the prohibition. Le caractère d'une nation est défini.
The character of a nation is defined by how it reacts to tragedies. Our country is more united than ever, and we need to continue to work together. The measures that we are announcing today are banning the most dangerous weapons, which represent the most significant threat to Canadian communities. That is what we promised to Canadians, and we owe it to them and to all of the victims who lost their lives too soon. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Mr. Prime Minister, colleagues, we're all fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic, but we had the worst shooting in our country. 22 people died at the hands of a heartless gunman. Canadians shared the burden felt by our comrades in Nova Scotia, and we understand the impact of armed violence in our communities, and this is nothing new. But what is new, however, is that this violence is more violent because of the proliferation of guns that are more violent and more lethal. They have no use for guns or sport. These weapons can kill too many too quickly. In '89, there was the Polytechnique shooting. In 2006, Dawson. In 2014, Moncton. And on January 22nd, 2017, there was Sainte-Foy. A young man killed 6 brothers, fathers. Motives can change from one tragedy to another. The context can change. The targets of these killers can change. Their MO can change. But there are 2 things that remain the same. There are always innocent victims who leave behind an emptiness that cannot be filled in the hearts of their loved ones. Also, we cannot change the fact that there are weapons that are made to kill, and these are weapons that we are going to be banning today. Chiefs of police, families, citizens have been asking for the prohibition of these weapons that were created for warfare and not for civilians in our communities. Today we are acting for the future. We are banning more than 1,500 types of military-grade assault weapons. Today marks the end of the market for these weapons. But before moving forward with this, we need to remind everyone that most gun owners in Canada are law-abiding gun owners and take all the measures necessary to ensure that their weapons are used and kept securely. However, these weapons are deadly and pose too great a risk when they fall into the hands of the wrong people, and the safety of the public is paramount. The measures that we are putting in place today will save lives. We also know that a ban is a part of the equation to reduce armed violence in Canada. We also need to take on contraband of these weapons, of handguns. We need to take on street gangs. We need to invest in prevention, and we need to have more education, more support in mental health. The work has started, and we are going to continue it. We started by investing $327 million over 5 years to counter gang and gun violence. We will be adopting C-71 that verifies the criminal history of buyers to make sure that weapons do not fall into the wrong hands. And today, we are going one step further, one significant step further, a historic step further that will save lives and make our societies safer for all. Thank you.
Good morning. I grew up on a farm in northern Alberta. We had guns on our farm, and we still do, as on many farms across our country. If there were bears around, my dad would keep a gun in his truck. And sometimes he'd hunt prairie chickens on his way home for supper. And you know what? Neither my dad nor any other farmer I knew then, or have known since, owned an assault rifle or an assault-style rifle. And that's because those weapons are not for hunting. They aren't for shooting a prairie chicken or scaring off a bear. They're designed for only one purpose: to kill people and to look like they can kill people. Lorsque nous réfléchissons
When we reflect on the massacre of the 14 women at Polytechnique, or the shooting at Dawson, or at the horrible tragedy that occurred in Nova Scotia at Portapique 12 days ago, this reinforces our determination.
Of 14 women at the École Polytechnique in 1989, or the Dawson College shooting in 2006, or the horrible tragedy in Portapique, Nova Scotia, just 12 days ago. Those heinous acts strengthen our resolve. And that resolve is to close the gaps in our gun control laws and to keep the most dangerous firearms out of civilian hands. We neither need nor want such weapons in our homes, in our pickups, in our communities, or on our streets. These guns make it easier to commit mass murder, and the culture around their fetishization makes our country inherently more dangerous for the people most vulnerable, and that is women and girls. Chaque femme et chaque fille qui nous écoute.
To all the women and girls, they all have a story to tell about a moment where they felt vulnerable or in danger. It is unacceptable that in 2020, that gender is still a factor that determines whether or not you feel safe at home and in your community.
Girl listening today remembers a time when she was made to feel unsafe, vulnerable, or in harm's way. We all know what that's like. It's unacceptable that in 2020, gender continues to be a determining factor in whether you feel safe in your home or on your street. During this pandemic, we are particularly concerned about the rise in gender-based and domestic violence. Frontline organizations have seen a surge in appeals from women and children fleeing violence. British Columbia's Battered Women's Support Services has received 300% more calls since the beginning of the pandemic. A Toronto-based shelter has seen a 400% increase in demand for shelter. And unfortunately, this isn't new. From 2010 to 2015, according to statistics compiled by the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative, there were 418 cases of domestic homicide in Canada, with 476 victims. Of the 427 adult victims, 79% were women. Let that number sink in. In 2019, according to the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, 118 women and girls died violently in Canada. On average, 1 every 3 days. Again, let that number sink in. Nous savons également que
We also know that the availability of these firearms is a danger to vulnerable populations like women, queer and trans folk, Indigenous people, and people of color. Women, girls, two-spirited, people who were assassinated or missing are one of the most significant examples. And it's a clear tragedy because of the violence in our country.
assault-style weapons puts vulnerable populations, women, queer and trans people, Indigenous people, and people of color at particular risk. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people are, for me, one of the starkest and most tragic examples of systemic violence in our society. Tackling systemic violence is our collective responsibility, one that requires us to challenge our attitudes, strengthen community support, ensure accountability for perpetrators, and, critically, keep deadly weapons out of their hands. La féminicide est un fléau dans notre...
Femicide is a serious problem in our society, and we need to put an end to it.
Long been a scourge in our society. It remains a scourge. We must stop it. In saying no to assault-style weapons, we are putting feminist ideas into practice. We are acting to ensure that our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers, our daughters, and we ourselves, indeed, that all women who have been victimized, frightened, threatened, harmed, brutalized, and killed by gun violence have not suffered in vain. Enough is enough. Assez, c'est assez.
Enough is enough. Thank you.
Madame la vice-première.
Thank you. Question period, starting with the phone. Operator?
Première question, Michel Lamarche, TVA Nouvelles. À vous.
Oui, bonjour.
Question. Yes, I have a question for Mr. Trudeau regarding the emergency plan on COVID-19. We're receiving lots of emails from seniors saying that they are suffering, that they need financial assistance. When will there be a plan to help seniors? They are waiting for this. Protecting the most vulnerable in this crisis has always been one of our priorities, and we know that seniors are more vulnerable to COVID-19. That is why, from the beginning, we took measures to help our seniors, but indeed, we do have more to do. We are working with the other parties, and we are working with people in the field in order to send help to the most vulnerable seniors, and we will be doing so shortly.
Has always been an essential element and the core of our response to COVID-19. And obviously, our seniors, our elders, are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. That's why we put forward a number of measures from the beginning, but why we will continue to work on supporting our vulnerable seniors.
Donc, une précision là-dessus.
So, another question. Can we expect a plan next week? And I have a question regarding the CERB. There are companies that aren't finding people to work because people are continuing to apply for CERB. It is more beneficial for them. Are you going to try to do something to help these entrepreneurs? Answer. Our priority is to ensure the health and safety of Canadians against COVID-19. That is why we put in place measures to encourage people to stay home, to protect themselves, and we want to protect our healthcare workers. We want, through these measures, to regain control in our country. Our next steps will be to examine how to reopen the economy, and we want to make sure that people can work safely, and we will do so. Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Charlie Pinkerton, iPolitics. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Will you explain how what your government is announcing today, how it will implement it without passing new legislation through Parliament?
What is being done today is being done entirely through regulations. That is a tool we have. But to move forward on the next steps, including an eventual buyback program, we will need to move forward through legislation in the House, and we will be adding further measures to that as well. I have spoken with all other parliamentary leaders, and I am confident that we will have the support necessary to move forward on strengthening gun legislation in this country when the time comes for us to move forward on legislation other than COVID-19.
So if it can do what it's doing today without legislation, why was your government not proactive instead of reactive, and why did it not put these in force earlier?
I will turn to Minister Blair to answer that, but we were ready to move forward about a month ago. We had been planning to do it in the late weeks of March. Obviously, COVID became a priority for all of us, particularly the Minister of Public Safety, who was concerned with borders, concerned with public safety on multiple levels, and we focused on that. But obviously, it remained and remains a priority for us to move forward, and that is why we are moving forward today. Bill?
Yes, Prime Minister, just to explain, there was a great deal of work that needed to be done, even though this is accomplished through regulation. We've been working very closely with the Attorney General and the Justice Department in the drafting of those regulations. There were a number of very significant issues to be addressed. We are all highly motivated by our commitments to keep people safe, and certainly the tragedy 12 days ago just deepened our resolve to move forward as quickly as possible. But we have been working quite diligently over the past several months in order to draft the regulations that bring forward these measures today. And as the Prime Minister has also indicated, there remains a great deal more work to do. And so at the very first opportunity, we'll be bringing forward legislation that will complete the work that we begin today through regulation by facilitating, and Parliament will determine, a number of different important measures on how we can move forward, as the Prime Minister has indicated, with a safe, effective, and responsible buyback program, but it also enable us to take additional measures that will significantly improve public safety, strengthen gun control regulations. This today is a very important first step, and it's a step that we have been working on over several months.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Catherine Lévesque, La Presse canadienne. À vous.
Oui, bonjour.
Question. Yes. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. I have a question regarding the timing of this announcement. We are today May 1st. Canadians are wondering whether or not they will be able to pay their bills. Small businesses are wondering whether or not they will even be able to survive. Why did you think that it would be a good moment to announce these measures on assault weapons? Even during this pandemic, even though society has slowed down or stopped, we have noticed the impacts of firearms. We noticed that 12 days ago. That is why it's always a good time to go forward with ensuring the safety of Canadians. We've been working hard for weeks to keep Canadians safe through COVID-19, but there are other things that need to be done, and that is why we moved forward with increased gun control, and that is why we are banning military-grade assault weapons.
We are very much focused on keeping Canadians safe from COVID-19, but even amid this terrible pandemic, we have seen the impact that someone with a gun can have in devastating the lives of family members, of communities in our country. That's why it is always a good moment to move forward on measures that keep Canadians safe, and that is why we are moving forward with this today. Christian?
J'ajouterai seulement, Premier ministre, que
I would like to add, Mr. Prime Minister, stated by Chrystia Freeland, that with physical distancing, our vulnerable population is more vulnerable than ever. Women and girls are seeing increased impacts of domestic violence, and this is why we need now more than ever these new rules. Thank you. Operator, last question on the phone, please.
Merci. Next question, Jim Bronskill, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Yes, for Minister Blair. Some say that one of the steps that must be taken to ensure that guns remain out of the hands of the people who should not have them are better screening and enforcement of prohibition orders when there are flags that someone should not have a gun due to mental illness or criminal history, and that there's now quite a range of discretion among officials in the justice system to whether to enact such a prohibition. Will the government move on that factor?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. And it's an important question. And I made reference earlier to the legislation that we intend to bring forward at the first opportunity. And I mentioned in particular that it includes a commitment to introduce red flag laws. And those are situations where an individual either represents a significant danger to themselves, perhaps an individual who might be suicidal, or someone who is involved in a domestic violence and intimate partner relationship, whereas there's a significant risk to that individual. And we have also seen, unfortunately, people in our society who are advocating hate and advocating violence against religious minorities or women or other vulnerable populations. And so we want to make sure that we have the tools to enable not just the police, but society, to victims, advocates, parents, teachers, to take the steps that are necessary to render that situation safe. And that's to remove firearms from that potentially dangerous situation and also to suspend that individual's ability to get access to guns. There is a work that we have done in Bill C-71 to strengthen background checks to make sure that individuals who should not have access to firearms don't get them. But we are going to take additional steps to keep them safe. Those prohibition orders, to be effective, have to be respected and they have to be enforced. And there has to be consequences for those who don't obey them. And that's why we are intending to strengthen our gun control and our gun laws to keep Canadians safe.
Just a quick follow-up. There's been some discussion about how the C-71 provisions, some key elements have not yet come into force. Can you give us a timeline for that? I realize COVID-19 may have disrupted that, and that I understood there were budgetary considerations and other factors why they may not be in place yet. But can you give us a timeline for the taking of effect of the provisions in C-71?
Yeah, of course, Jim. And I will tell you, C-71 was a very significant step forward in our last parliament by our government to introduce legislation that will have a very positive effect in keeping people safe. And there remain a number of elements of C-71 which we are in the process of implementing, and they are important. Notwithstanding that we have been very occupied, obviously, in our response to COVID-19, that response has been entirely about keeping Canadians safe. And unfortunately, during this particular pandemic, we have not, although we've seen a change in a lot of society and even a reduction in a number of different types of crimes, we have not seen a reduction in gun violence. We have not seen a reduction in domestic violence. And in fact, because of some of the social distancing and social isolation rules that are in place, that risk, that potential harm has actually been exacerbated. And so we're highly motivated to move forward. Let me assure you and all Canadians, the implementations of those important measures on Bill C-71 remain a high priority for us. There is much that we are working on now towards implementation. There are some additional budgetary measures that will need to be implemented, and that will require the consent of Parliament. But when we're ready, we'll move forward as quickly as possible.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Selon les informations dont on dispose,
Louis Blouin from Radio-Canada, your government did not opt for a mandatory buyback program. That means that weapons that are targeted today could still be found in private residences. How will you ensure that these weapons will not be used to commit a violent crime? All buyback programs will need to be made into bills, and so we will have to work with the other parties, with different groups throughout the country to make sure that this buyback program be the best one, that it be fair, and we want it to have the necessary impact. Things are still being ironed out. Today's announcement means that from now on, military-grade assault weapons cannot be used in Canada, and the next steps still need to be ironed out.
Today, ensure that the use, the purchase, the sale of military-style assault weapons in this country end today. The numbers of those military-style assault weapons in this country will only go down from here. Designing an appropriate and fair and effective buyback program is something that we will do as part of a legislative requirement, and we will therefore be working with other parties in the House, with stakeholders across the country, to ensure that it is done right, to be both effective and impactful in keeping Canadians safe.
donc juste pour être certain, vous n'êtes pas encore...
Question. So, you don't know whether or not if it'll be mandatory. Also, are you going to review the classification of weapons so that a manufacturer cannot create a new model that would go to market and that would circumvent the list that you put forward today? Answer. I'm going to give the floor to Minister Blair, who will be able to add to my answer. One of the biggest challenges in our weapons classification system is that manufacturers of weapons can create variations of these weapons that circumvent the classification system that we have. One of the things that we're going to do moving forward is to ensure that this classification system be constantly updated. We want to follow what is happening in the market for these weapons. That way, we'll always be up to date, and we will always be able to protect Canadians.
Looking at right now is ensuring that our system of classification of of firearms is ever evolving, that keeps up with modifications brought in by manufacturers, keeps up with new variants and new technologies. We need to make sure that we are constantly updating and ensuring updating our classification system to ensure that Canadians are kept safe. Bill, you have perhaps a couple of words.
Actually, you've covered it very well, Prime Minister. Our intent is to keep it evergreen. When the classification system was implemented in the late 90s, the system that was put in place was rigid and inflexible, and it kind of let us down because, quite frankly, the manufacturers brought in a number of different variants that got around those classifications. We will put a legislative framework in place in the legislation that we'll bring forward that will create a new evergreen framework for classifications so that as new weapons are introduced into the market, Canada will be able to respond quickly to ensure that only those weapons which are safe for use in this country will be available to Canadians.
Hi, Tom Parry with CBC. The shooter in Nova Scotia was using illegal weapons, and a lot of illegal weapons come in from the United States. So why not target those weapons as opposed to going after lawful gun owners?
Today, we are banning military-style assault weapons in this country, weapons that are designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to kill as many people as possible in a short amount of time as possible. Those guns have no place in Canada, and the measures we're putting forward will reduce the amount of those guns in Canada and eventually keep more Canadians safe. But there is more to do. There are more measures to take, and we look forward to moving forward on those. And for those, I'll turn it back to Minister Blair.
If I may, first of all, the responsibility for identifying the weapons that were used in Nova Scotia is with the RCMP, and the release of any information pertaining to those is theirs. But I can tell you that every firearm begins legally and then moves into an illegal market. And I can say with some confidence that the two long guns that were involved in that investigation, without identifying them, are included on today's list.
Hi, Crystal Logue with Global News. Prime Minister, regarding the new gun measures, can you confirm if you plan to ban all all automatic rifles, and why not look at banning handguns? They are causing more deaths in Canada every year.
Today, we're moving forward with a ban on military-style assault weapons. We have established criteria that cover about 1,500 models and variants of those guns that are in Canada or available to Canadians. This will make sure that we have safer communities as of today and in the months and years to come. At the same time, there is more to do on strengthening gun control. We made significant commitments to Canadians back in 2015 and moved forward on them in the last mandate, and we're continuing to move forward on the commitments to strengthen gun control in this country, including allowing cities and municipalities the ability to restrict the use of handguns. These are things that we will move forward on in the coming months as the parliamentary calendar returns to dealing with things other than COVID-19. Nous avons pris des mesures concrètes pour bannir à partir d'aujourd'hui les armes militaires.
We have taken concrete measures to ban military-style assault weapons that do not have their place in this country. We recognize that it's only one step of all of the things that we need to do regarding handguns and other things. We also need to fight domestic violence. We will continue to increase gun control in this country, and in order to do so, we will need to go through Parliament, and we will do this work once the government is able to focus on something other than COVID-19.
National news, you talked about this 2-year amnesty period for people, law-abiding gun owners, to give back these guns on this list. Does that mean that Canadians that don't comply would be fined or arrested? And how much will you compensate people that give back these firearms?
A couple of questions, and I think the Attorney General could probably give you the details of the amnesty. But essentially, it's a non-permissive amnesty, which as the Attorney General has already explained, would allow a person who lawfully acquired these firearms to continue for a 2-year period to retain possession of them. But during that 2-year period, they can't use them. They can't go hunting with them. They can't take them to the range and shoot them. They can't sell them or transfer them. It is very restrictive on what they can actually do with the weapon, and it will have to be stored securely in a properly and approved vault during that period of time. The 2-year period of amnesty enables us to bring forward legislation that with a safe and effective buyback program that will allow those individuals who lawfully acquire these things. One of the things we're trying to avoid, the Canadians who purchased these guns did so legally. And we did not want to create a situation by prohibiting them all moving forward of putting those people in criminal jeopardy. And so we have implemented a period of amnesty to allow us to bring forward legislation and a program that will enable those Canadians who originally purchased these guns to dispose of them and not to put themselves to be placed in a position of criminal jeopardy. As I said, we respect Canadians who obey the law, and the law quite appropriately is now changed. And so we will do the work necessary and work with them to bring them into a lawful situation, and for all Canadians, a safer situation by the elimination of these weapons in our society.
Thank you. The standard criminal code provisions still apply. This is a regulation that derives from the criminal code. So the same structure, fines and penalties that exist for other firearms violations exist here. That hasn't changed. The amnesty is also a regulation that does give that non-permissive period where one can, in a very limited way, transport the weapons for certain reasons, but otherwise can't use them.
Compensation?
That will be determined, as we've said, through a buyback program that we'll have to do through Parliament. I mean, that requires a budget, that requires a law, and so we will require the usual parliamentary processes and safeguards, I might add, moving forward, again, with the cooperation and collaboration of our partners in the House of Commons.
It's May 1st, hard to believe, but it is May 1st, and rent is due for Canadians across the country. We know that the CERB has helped many people, but they have to choose, especially in big cities, Prime Minister, between do I pay my rent or do I get groceries this month? It's just not enough. I know this is provincial jurisdiction, but your government has stepped in for commercial renters here. Is there anything more you can do to help regular Canadian renters out there who can't pay their bills today?
From the very first, our focus through this COVID-19 crisis has been ensuring that Canadians who are vulnerable because of a loss of a paycheck or loss of a job, who don't have money coming in to be able to pay their rent or pay their groceries, get a reliable source of income. And that's why we move forward with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. That's why we are moving forward with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, so that people actually can rely on money coming in to pay their everyday needs, which include groceries and rent. We have moved forward with commercial rent support for businesses because businesses, we need them to be able to come back strongly after this pandemic is through, or after this phase of the lockdown is through. But we recognize that this is a difficult time for everyone, and we are looking to try and help. But the CERB and the wage subsidy will go a significant distance towards helping many, many Canadians get through this difficult time. Sure. Christian?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, it's a really good question. And I think it's also important for landlords to understand that these are exceptional times in our country, and now is a time for all Canadians to stick together and support each other. So if you have a tenant who has lost income because of coronavirus, now is a time to be really compassionate. That is the way that you support your neighbors and your country in this difficult time. And it's also a time for banks to be really thoughtful about the mortgages that those landlords have to pay. We're going to get through this, and we will get through it by supporting each other and acting together.
Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Prime Minister, we know that the federal stockpile did not have adequate supplies of personal protective equipment. I'm wondering what Canadians and medical workers should be able to expect from the stockpile for the next pandemic.
The national stockpile is in place to supplement the stockpiles that provinces need to have across the country to deal with emergencies that could arise. As we've seen through this pandemic, both at the provincial level and the national level, we should have had more. We needed to have more. That's why we've been working so incredibly hard over these past weeks to source personal protective equipment and necessary medical supplies from around the world. And we have largely been successful in meeting the need of Canadians right across the country. But it took an awful lot of scrambling, an awful lot of effort that ideally wouldn't have had to happen. So there are certainly lessons to be learned going forward as we ensure that stockpiles are adequate, both at the provincial and the federal level. And that will be certainly one of the things that has been learned through this pandemic. On top of that, in terms of domestic procurement, we are seeing local manufacturers, domestic manufacturers, step up in significant ways to ensure that we have the equipment needed, not just for medical professionals on the front lines now, but as we look towards a reopening economy that will require more PPE across many sectors.
So what does that actually mean as for your federal commitment? Does that mean you will stockpile it for a certain number of weeks going forward? Will you mandate this? Will you put it into legislation? What are you actually committing it will look like going forward?
Right now, our commitment is to help Canadians going through this pandemic right now with the equipment they need, with the support they need, and our focus is entirely on filling those needs as quickly as possible. There will, of course, need to be very careful reflections about how we make sure that if this ever happens again, we are much better prepared. That is something that we are all going to be committed to. It is something that Canadians will expect and something that this government will do.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui.
Thank you. That concludes today's press conference. Thank you.